All right, so today I am going to be giving you guys a talk that is very, very personal to me. It's not necessarily like a vulnerable personal thing, but more of a life pursuit personal thing to me. So this is something that is constantly in my head. I'm thinking about it every day, in and out, no matter what's going on. And oftentimes if you see me take out my phone to write something down, it's because I'm writing something down. I'm not actually using my phone to text or Snapchat or Instagram as often as people believe. And this is a very small glimpse into some of the results of that. And what is that, of course? So let's start with a little bit of a preface, who I am. And I said this in the last talk, but I'm going to say it again. I'm running for president in 2032. Thank you. Thank you. And this is something that is very important to me, and I'm going to tell you guys how that started. So for me, it was August 2017, so it was a few years ago. I'm just approaching my third year, or third complete year of research. But what started that was actually a dream. It was one of those mornings where you're really comfortable in bed. You wake up, you see the light streaming through your blinds, just a little stripe bouncing off the wall. And you're really comfortable, so you go back to sleep. You wake up again. You roll over. You go back to sleep. You wake up again, right? And it was one of those moments. Have you ever been doing that and then started having dreams again, right? So it was one of those moments. I had a dream. Now, how many of you guys have had those really uncommon but super real dreams, right? The ones that are so real they feel like a memory, right? So for me, that's what I had. It was 3 seconds long. But I had one of those dreams that was so real it felt like a memory. But the problem is, or the thing that stood out to me, was because it wasn't from the past, it was what was ahead of me. And I remember I was sitting in the Oval Office. I remember it because I thought it was interesting, because the curvature of the walls around me, right? I'd never been in a room where the walls were curved like that. I was sitting there. I had this big desk right behind me, and I was leaning up against it. I was just sitting there, just soaking in for a moment the peace and quiet of such an office. And it was the day I'd been elected. It was the first time I'd been in there. And I asked for a moment alone. It was just me, that office, that desk that I was leaning against, and my thoughts. And I was at absolute peace. Now, I'm not talking about relaxed and had a good meditation, absolute peace. I'm talking about a level of peace that I've never felt in my entire life and that I did not think was even possible. This is beyond what I've ever even imagined the stereotypical mountaintop enlightened person achieving. And I felt that. I felt this peace, and it was overwhelming. And it was so surreal. And I woke up. All of that was in 3 seconds. I was just sitting there in my office at absolute peace. In that moment, I rolled over, grabbed my phone, and opened up a new note. It was plans of a president. And I started writing down the first thing I thought of. Don't even remember what it was now, but I kept writing, and I kept writing, and I kept writing. And all of a sudden, I was building my future platform, my future campaign, my future everything, my future world that I was going to actually build, not even just get to witness. And all of that came because of that feeling. It wasn't about the office. I was not motivated by the cool shape of the walls, the curvature, the nice desk I was leaning against, all that history there. I was actually motivated by that sense of peace. Because I'd never felt that before, and I wanted to feel that. And even if it was absolutely crazy, that office is the closest thing in the real world that I know I can get to that. And that's what got this started for me. And something interesting happens when you have a dream like that. The whole world for me has become that training ground. For me, that whole world, every day I see something on the news. I have a conversation with a friend. I'm constantly looking at this as, oh, this situation, how could I help? Oh, this person, what did they teach me? Oh, this environment, how can I improve it? And all of this is constantly in my head, every second of every day, every conversation. And what I'm going to share with you guys today are a couple of principles that I've derived after 3 years of active writing. And when I say active writing, we're talking 5,000 to 10,000 words a month. I could have written a couple novels by this point. I have written a couple novels by this point. I actually called up a self-publishing company, and I printed a single copy of these books because it's too much for me to have on my phone and be able to read through. So I actually have physical hard copy books, and they're this thick right now. It's a proper book, maybe 2. But what I'm going to share with you guys today are 3 of 6 principles that I've been able to derive after long, long hours of writing things down and then looking back and finding trends and realizing, oh, this problem was solved in this way. This problem was solved in this way. But these solutions are actually the same approach. So 3 years of research has led me to 3 of the principles that I'm going to share with you, and then another 3, but I don't have enough time to talk about those. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the first one, super habitability. And if you type it on your phone, it will autocorrect and put a space in there or a hyphen or something like that because the word is not an actual dictionary word. I first heard this word, I think it was my freshman year of college, 2014, autumn, and I was reading some article. Me being the hard partying college kid I was sitting there reading a science article on a Friday night, and there were a couple scientists talking about the concept of super habitable worlds. And what these scientists do is there's all those space satellites and telescopes in space, and they use those to take pictures of faraway objects without the atmosphere blocking some of that light or bending the image a little bit. And they were talking about the criteria they used to find a good planet. Now, how many of you guys, when you guys were in middle school or high school science class, you learned that Earth was a Goldilocks world? We're not too hot, not too cold, we're just right for liquid water, right? So a lot of scientists, and up until when I was reading that article and those scientists publishing that paper, every scientist was looking for worlds that were Earth-like. We figured that's the best chance we have of finding a world with life. That's our best chance of proving to ourselves that we are not alone in the universe. And then these researchers were wondering, well, what if there are worlds that are more habitable than Earth? Think about this. 2/3 of the Earth is ocean. Only 1/3 is land. Most of the ocean is empty. The coastlines support life, but the vast majority of the ocean is empty. So that's already 2/3 of the Earth that does not really support life. Of land, 1/3 of that remaining third of land is desert. That's Arctic tundra, and that's Sahara Desert. 25% of that land is mountainous, or difficult to traverse, which leaves you with 14% of Earth's land area that is easily habitable. It's not as much as we thought. And so super habitability is the idea. These scientists say they set up some new criteria for searching for these new worlds, but super habitability is basically the idea of how can we make this world more habitable than it ever was. These days you'll see headlines, conversations are always talking about how can we restore lost nature. But I think that's a terrible approach. Restoring nature has an endpoint, and that endpoint is basically the way it was before. Super habitability is a philosophy, it's a principle we can apply indefinitely, forever. And that principle is how can we continuously make this world more habitable? How can we continuously add more to this world? So let me give you an example. This is Mount Vernon. That's George Washington's estate. It was built by his father a long time ago. It's beautiful. So this is the Potomac. It's up on this big, beautiful hill. I went there back in 8th grade, and it's peaceful, and it's wonderful. It's just south of D.C. And George Washington lived there. And in the Potomac back then, he proclaimed it America's river because the Potomac River was so beautifully, it was crystal clear. The water was fresh. It was constantly flowing. It truly was a pristine, almost magical thing. And he would sit down on his porch, and he would watch, and he would see dolphins. There were dolphins in the Potomac River. Those dolphins disappeared in the 1880s as industry developed. And back in the early days of industry, we didn't have an understanding of the environment. And so industry back then just polluted the river. By the 1880s, life was really not seen in the rivers. People forgot there were even dolphins there. I believe dolphins themselves, there was no more documentation within the next few decades, and they disappeared. But we started to improve that. We started to correct that. Environmental efforts by various American groups have started to restore many of America's waterways, to the point where some of them are actually becoming more clean than they were before. The Potomac is, of course, not hyper clean, but it is finally clean enough that all of this lost life is starting to come back. Dolphins are pretty finicky, but they're back. In 2015, there were 200 dolphins that were recorded in the Potomac. In just a few years, that number has increased to over 1,000. And 1 year ago, actually 11 months ago, we witnessed the first birth of a baby dolphin in the river, which means dolphins are finally back and they are breeding. This is a photo of some of those dolphins. It's a very exciting thing. Let me give you another great story. So this is Chicago, 2015. You guys see over there in the corner in the parking lot? That's a coyote. A wild animal. Right in the middle of downtown Chicago. How does that work? What? I thought cities were for humans. Well, that's not really the case. Nature is still there. It is all around us. The biggest mistake humans make in reference to nature is thinking we are separate from it. But in reality, we are just as much a part of it as we have always been. And coyotes in the city are one of my favorite examples to show that. Coyotes have really only been documented in cities for about 20 years or so. They actually track them. They've tagged some of them with tracking collars. And you can see them meandering up and down different streets. They have different territories, where they sleep, where they get food, all of that. And that's downtown Chicago. Super habitability. This is an excellent example of that, of how even though we think we changed the face of the world so much, I mean, we've literally transcended geography. We've flattened mountains, turned off rivers, and all that stuff in some of the biggest cities in the world. But yet nature is just as much there as before. Let me give you another example. This is Austin, Texas. That is just a bridge. They built it half a century ago, I think. And then after they built it, they noticed some bats moving in. Why are bats in the city? Well, that's kind of weird. But then they cleared some of the bats out, and then the bats came back. And some conservationists, they asked them, they're like, how do we get rid of the bats? We got to get rid of them. And the conservationists were like, why? Like, you guys are in a city. Do you know how much people hate bugs? Do you know how many bugs bats eat? And after a little while, they started a conservation program. They started to protect them. Now, it is a massive tourist spot, and there are 1.5 million bats, all living under one bridge, one random bridge, in Austin, downtown Austin. Those bats eat just about every bug for 30 miles. That city is bug-free, pest-free, and it all happens because they are now living together with bats, not separately from nature. That's the largest urban bat colony in the world. That's larger than many bat colonies around the world, even in nature. Zooming out a little bit, let's talk about the world. This is a graphic from a NASA study. They studied the amount of foliage on plants around the world for 20 years. And what they found is that in the last 20 years, from 2000 through 2019, the world was getting greener. The whole world is preaching these tales of doom and destruction, and in reality, it's just change. But when you look at plant life, you start to see that change is a good change. Notably, China and India are getting extremely green. Europe's getting pretty good at it. America's getting pretty good at it. And you can see all of this. Over here, it's agriculture. They're getting better at education and agricultural innovation in India. Over here, it's environmental programs that have been in the works for 50 years. We're finally starting to see like the big effects. Full ecosystems are finally restoring. Animals are coming back. And that whole big complex cycle of life that's constantly changing and adapting and evolving is restoring things. I said earlier, there's only 14% of the surface of the Earth that is really easily habitable. And even if you extend that a little bit to a few undersea vents at the bottom of the ocean and a few mountains where there's still a little bit of life there, and the coastlines, beaches and stuff like that, it's still pretty close to 14. What would happen if we could bring that up to 20? That's a 30 or 40% increase of the habitability of this world. What would happen if we raised it up to 20, allocated half of that to food, half of that to nature? We'd be able to support billions of more people on this world and billions of more species, all at once, all together, on one big, super habitable world. I promise you this is the only pun of this presentation, but this is a good quote to summarize super habitability. This is our home. This is our planet. Isn't it time we finally plan it? We are a worldwide species. We are a global species. Let's step up to the challenge. The next principle I would like to introduce to you guys is geographic independence. Now, what do I mean by that? Geographic independence is, well, first of all, it's a mouthful. It almost covers the entire screen right there. But geographic independence is a really, really interesting concept, and it's actually my personal favorite because I've been able to apply this one in more cases than all the other principles combined in a lot of my research. Let me give you an example. I'll use a current example. The current crisis of coronavirus has had a number of famous spikes. There was the big spike in Italy, and there was the big spike in New York. That is the U.S. naval ship Comfort, sailing into the New York harbor. The Comfort is an old oil tanker. It was decommissioned decades ago, and the Navy, they bought it up, and they renovated the whole thing all the way across, and they turned it into a 1,000-bed hospital. It has surgery rooms and bathrooms. It has everything you could ever think of to be a fully functioning hospital. In the past, we've used this. Every now and then when a country suffers a major crisis, political collapse, for example, is a common one, we'll actually sail this boat to the nearest harbor of the next door country. And when people flee across the border, we can get them medical treatment right away. When that need isn't there, however, the boat is somewhere else, serving more people. Ships like this are an excellent example of geographic independence because now we have a 1,000-bed hospital that can be within 100 kilometers of 80% of the human population. Most humans live near the ocean or close to that. We can now bring the hospital to them. Another example I'd like to give you guys is the Loma Prieta earthquake, and I might have mispronounced that, please forgive me. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a 6.9 magnitude earthquake. It was in the San Francisco area. It was devastating. It was 10 seconds long, give or take. 10 seconds long. But it caused a lot of destruction. $10 billion in damage. Dozens dead, thousands injured. And the interesting thing about this was it happened during the Baseball World Series. They just started the broadcast at 5 o'clock. And then at 5:04, things start to shake, the camera gets shaky, and you can hear the announcer, who was just announcing and narrating some, past footage. And you can hear him, and he goes, "Oh, I think there's an Earth." And then we lost the feed. So the whole nation got to watch this as it unfolded. And, how does help get to you when the roads look like that? How do ambulances and fire trucks travel across town to rescue people from collapsed buildings, to rescue people who are trapped in their cars, to rescue people who are suffering from power outages causing major problems? Well, they took the subway. One thing you guys may not know is if you study geology, earthquakes travel along the surface of the Earth. They don't go deep. They start from some big crack or fissure deep in the Earth usually, kilometers down, miles down. Then the energy goes up to the surface and spreads out like waves in an ocean. There's no such thing as underwater waves, in case anyone was wondering, right? That's exactly how earthquakes work. I was a tour guide in a cave system several years ago, and this cave was incredibly small and incredibly disappointing, and we told a lot of made-up stories. And that cave was like 40 feet underground, and we had an earthquake. I had no clue. Until after I got out, my coworkers were like, "Dude, is everyone okay?" When this earthquake hit, rescue workers, once they realized the extent of the devastation and the destruction, they realized that the San Francisco system, I believe it's called BART, that's their subway system, they took that, and they were able to go pretty much anywhere in the city because the tunnels were undamaged. The earthquake, the energy of that earthquake that injured thousands of people, did not damage any of the underground sections of that line. So there's another example of geographic independence. Geography is something we've freed ourselves from by putting tunnels underground, allowing us to move goods and services, and in this case, rescuers, to where they're needed most, without any disruption. Let me give you another example. In 2018, Russia launched a floating power plant. It was a very innovative thing. But basically, it's just a power plant on a big floating square. But you guys remember when I was talking about the Navy ship? They can tow that anywhere. Russia has a lot of remote coastlines. They have a lot of industry out there, mining, lumber, and so on. They have a lot of remote towns. Building infrastructure in the remote areas is almost impossible. It's incredibly expensive. And for those who are on the environmental side of things, building a road that travels 1,000 miles in that direction to connect to one small town, that's expensive, and it disrupts a whole lot of things. So they just built the power in a dedicated facility where they could build it to high standards, and then they just shipped it out. They just tugged it with tugboats to where it needed to go. And I believe, to this day, it is currently powering a remote town. And when they're done, well, they can tow that boat back to a dedicated facility for decommissioning. So now you have no environmental impact at all for your power supplies in these remote areas. One more example. This one is much earlier in its development, are desalination ships. So water desalination, the ocean is salty. Take the salt out, we can drink it, right? Very straightforward. It is a little bit energy intensive, and that's why it's not common that you see that everywhere. But the industry is innovating very fast, and the cost of this is going down very quickly. And to the point where we can almost put it on boats. There's currently a couple companies that are working on this. And what they're doing is they're actually taking retired ships, just like the Navy ships, recommissioning them to work in a different service. And basically, what they're dreaming of or looking to is cities. Remember I said the vast majority of people live near the coast, right? Cities these days are running out of water. The city of Johannesburg in South Africa almost did. Their water supplies were actually extremely low. The entire city rallied. They cut water pressure. They had water limits, and they were very strict about this. And to the point where they were within a few weeks of the city running out of water. But then they overcame it. They built new facilities. They got access to more water. And they are currently back it up and running. And that was because of innovations like this. Access to water is considered one of the greatest threats to the human species in the 21st century. That is primarily due to the re-geographication of the world, where right now the climate is shifting, and so we don't know where the water supplies are moving to. Right? Deserts are becoming rainforests, rainforests are becoming deserts, things like that. And so that instability is considered a risk. There's a term you can look up called water wars that has been showing up more and more frequently. But yeah, needless to say, this is another ship-based thing. But the idea is if we can transcend geography, then it's no longer going to hinder us. Think of a classic example, a very simple example. Imagine you're driving to work and a snowstorm hits. Are you going to show up late to work? Now imagine if your form of transportation, whatever that may be, was one that was not affected by snow. Perhaps you take the train underground, right? Simple things like that can affect the common man and can affect entire populations. And it's all based on one single principle, the geographic independence. So I'll wrap this section up with another quote. Nature always wins, but we don't always have to face it. I'm now going to introduce to you guys the individual supercapacity. And this one I consider the most empowering of all of them. So what is individual supercapacity? So first, I'll point out, you guys see the word supercapacity. It looks pretty similar to superhabitability, right? Supercapacity is also not a word in the dictionary. Supercapacitors are, but that's a different thing. Supercapacity is another word. It's just like superhabitability, right? Now, capacity. Every human being has different capacities, right? Some of us have a certain degree of intellect, or a certain degree of strength, or a certain degree of aesthetic looks as per the social norms of the time, right? Supercapacity is basically saying, how can we enhance the average human, right? 100 years ago, the United States did not have a standardized education system, and then we did. And guess who had the largest economic growth of the 20th century? Guess who brought about the most incredible innovations? Guess who cured many global diseases? Guess who funded hundreds of countries around the world out of their developing age into the modern age? A lot of that came not because the US said, okay, we're going to be really good, but because they invested in the average person. It's not about raising your peak capacity, it's about raising your average capacity. Who cares if you've got one super performer in 1 million people if the 1 million people can't do anything? If you have 1 million people who are semi-capable, that is a lot more than one super performer will ever do. And that is what individual supercapacity is. Now let me give you an example. In World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, we declared war. An event like that galvanized the nation. The whole country saw the newsreels. They read the newspapers. I've got a couple. But when the whole country rallied to defend their nation, to protect their homes, their lands, their families, 40% of recruits were turned away. And that was because they were malnourished. They were skinny. They couldn't hold a gun. They couldn't endure a battle. The U.S. government saw this and they realized this is a problem. Because if the U.S. gets into any other war, we may not be able to win even if we are the better people, even if we are fighting for a truly good cause. There's no guarantee we could win if almost half of our country is uneven able to defend it. These days, there's a lot of programs in the government that are nutrition-based, nutritional support programs. SNAP is one of them, I believe. And a lot of those came about from this research. It basically said, hey, there are people, many of them who are living outside of cities, far away, who cannot afford things. They live off the land, they are simple people, but they cannot afford nutrition, higher levels of nutrition that we're trying to provide for people in the cities. So they created programs like this to basically subsidize or make it easier to access this nutritional food. Because of that, that number has gone down significantly. I don't know what that number is today, but many, many recruits are not turned away now for malnutrition. Let me give you another example. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina came and devastated New Orleans. This entire picture, everything is flooded. All you can see are the roofs of houses. Hurricane Katrina was one of the worst hurricanes in American history. It caused a lot of damage. There was a lot of lives lost. And when this happened, most of us who were alive during that time, this was all over the news too. We saw it. And a lot of people were asking, how can I help? Because it's a basic human instinct. Every time someone is in need, I've never seen someone who said, I don't want to help. When times are actually tough, every human is there to help. So how can we empower them? Well, this is what they did at the time. When the city was flooded, the residents of Galveston, Texas, and the surrounding areas who had boats, they all rallied. They all stuck their boat on the trailer, and they drove to Louisiana. They saved a lot of lives. This was not a coordinated rescue effort. This was not managed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This was not managed by local rescuers. These were individuals who said, I can help. And they did. A lot of lives were saved from that. And we would not have gotten out of that in the same way we did without the support of all those individual people. 12 years later, Hurricane Harvey hit Texas. Guess who returned the favor? Guess who showed up and said, hey, you saved our lives, let us help you. The residents of Louisiana rallied. They called themselves the Cajun Navy. You can look this up, and it's a beautiful story. And they all did the same thing. They hitched up their boats, they went to Texas, and instead of walking down the street, they got their boats and went down the streets and rescued people from neighborhoods, tall buildings, short buildings, everywhere. And again, once again, this was not managed by a central group. This was not coordinated by this or that. These were people. They saw need, and they followed their most basic instinct, and that was to help. I'm going to wrap up this one with one more quote. The strength of the individual brings power to the community. A lot of people have talked about this, and you'll see philosophical discussions on this all the time about forms of government, philosophies of life, and all this. And a lot of people seem to agree on the idea that we are or should be approaching some form of society where we have a strong community, where that's the most important thing. It's not about the individual to do whatever they want. But what everyone has missed is that power of the community comes from strength of the individual. When the individuals, when the members of a community are empowered, that's when the community has resilience. That's when the community has capacity. That's when the community has capability. And that is when a community can never be broken. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.